Welcome back to We Dream, a podcast from Dream.org, a national nonprofit working to close prison doors and open doors of opportunity into the green economy. Together, we're building a future rooted in freedom, dignity, and opportunity for all. This season, we're exploring how to reimagine a justice system that puts people over punishment with a special focus on the Trump administration's expected crime bill, what it could mean, why tough on crime policies cause harm, and how we can push for real solutions. I'm Naomi Garcia-Hector at Dream.org.
And I'm Janos Spartan.
So today we're going to bring on a special guest. Janos, who are we going to have on?
We are having on Princeton Professor and longtime ACLU Senior Director Udi Ofer, who has been involved in the criminal justice movement for a very long time, about this entire century.
And Janos, I'm curious, any particular reason to bring him on as our first non-Dream.org guest?
Absolutely. Other than Udi being my boss when I was at the ACLU, and doing really good work with him around the country. Udi's been a real evangelist for the idea of criminal justice bipartisanship, especially one of the only people I think on the left who really keeps pushing that angle even today. And I think it'll be really instructive for people to hear why he believes that, what the trajectory is for bipartisan criminal justice reform, and really hearing that conversation in the context of the crime bill, how the crime bill itself is not a refutation of a decade of successful bipartisan work, but rather an outlier, something that, yes, we'll need to deal with, but something that once we've defeated it, we can go back to focusing on what's working in terms of bringing people together across party lines at the state and federal level.
This is going to be a great one. Let's jump in.
All right. We want to welcome to the Dream.org podcast, Princeton Professor and Criminal Justice OG, Udi Ofer. Udi has played many roles in the movement, from being involved with the fight against stop and frisk back in the day in New York City to founding the Smart Justice campaign, which I got to work for several years at the ACLU. That work took him all around the country. We'll definitely dig into that. And now reporting from his ivory tower in Princeton, New Jersey. It's really exciting. Udi, welcome to our second Crime Bill podcast.
It's really exciting to be here, and I want to say a couple of things. First of all, we did not have enough of you at the ACLU. You left us way too early because you decided to run for a district attorney, which was great for the movement, but not great for the ACLU. But it's so great to see all the amazing work that you've been doing, Janos. We're all really proud of you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And I feel like we got a lot done together in our limited window, and we'll definitely dig into some of that. So I wanted to have you on because, like I said, you've been around this movement from before it was really as widespread and popular a bipartisan criminal justice movement as it was, and then even to the present day. I feel like you've been a serious evangelist for the bipartisan nature of the criminal justice movement as a fellow member of the left, and that's a sometimes dying breed. So I refreshed my memory. I saw that it was about a year ago that you wrote an article called Bipartisan criminal justice reform is very much still alive, which I think says a couple things. One is that you're an optimist like myself, and also that the article was obviously written in response to a somewhat prevailing notion that it might be dead, right? So let's just start there. I mean, do you think the bipartisan criminal justice movement is still alive, and what makes you think so?
Yeah, I very much do. And actually, I believe it more than I even believed in it last year. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, so let me make the case. First, I think people need to start changing the way they think about the politics of crime and criminal justice reform, as I think most people are still stuck in a 1990s framework. And most people tend to think of two camps. There's the tough on crime camp, and then there's a pro-reform or soft on crime, if you may, camp. And I think we're actually at a totally different place today, and that we need to stop thinking of this issue as if we're still stuck in 1990s America. There is overwhelming data to indicate the criminal justice reform has become an evergreen issue, that the mindset of both voters and policymakers has changed, and that people overwhelmingly recognize that there are many excesses in the system, many injustices, and that this needs to change. Now, look, there's still big differences, even radical differences, in what kind of reform people want to see, right? There's the incremental camp, there's the transformational reform camp, but I will double down on the belief that there's widespread consensus among voters and the public on the need for reform, and that crosses the political spectrum, right? This is supported by polling data. Just, in October, Gallup released a poll that I literally jumped in my seat when I saw it, that found that a record low percentage of Americans believe that juveniles should be treated as adults when they commit serious crimes, right? Which is like the total opposite of what President Trump right now is calling for. And then there are criminologists, sociologists, political scientists who have documented in a scientifically rigorous way that American attitudes have fundamentally changed. And folks like Peter Enns, all the way back to 2016, documented that people just think of this issue differently, that they recognize that the system went too far and that we need to correct it. Now, there may be differences in what a correction looks like, and that I agree that there are differences there. But I actually believe that criminal justice reform has become a super majoritarian issue, and that we're in what I call the smart justice era, right? And that is really where people are. And it's, in fact, President Trump that's the outlier. And even within the Republican Party, as you know better than most people, Janos, even within the Republican Party today, there is a loud chorus of voices who call for reform. Now, again, there may be differences in how radical the reform should be. Should it be incremental? Should it be transformational? But it's still there. And the last thing I'll say, if I may, the facts on the ground support this theory, right? Even during the second Trump administration. So from January until today, we've seen 14 states in 2025 alone that have passed bipartisan criminal justice reform, right? Deep red states like Alabama, Mississippi, South Dakota, purple states like Arizona, Georgia, blue states like Colorado, Maryland, New Mexico. I mean, the list goes on and on. Even more states passing in 2024, more 2023. So the narrative is wrong that the movement is dead, because if you look at the states, reforms continue even during this heightened polarized period. It just doesn't get a lot of attention, and some of that is purposeful. I think
right. Sometimes attention is bad in these situations, right? Because it elevates it into the culture war, right? I mean, we passed 3 bills this year in red states, and I think Arizona, Missouri, and Arkansas, and certainly in the last 2, it flew largely under the radar. But to your point, it was an overwhelming number of Republicans supported it from start to finish. It just maybe not the loudest thing to talk about, but they understood the reason for it.
Yeah, and I think Arizona is actually a great example, right? Arizona, I believe, particularly the U.S. senators from Arizona are going to play a big role if there is like a crime bill that Trump tries to pass. But Arizona this year passed a bill to end the crack to powder cocaine sentencing disparity. Republicans control both chambers of the legislature, and it was signed into law by a Democratic governor. Right? Last year, Arizona passed probation reform and occupational licensing before. The year before, it passed prison reform. Every year, it's passing some kind of reform, but we don't hear about it. And like you said, Janos, a lot of that is purposeful. But for me, like as someone who's trying to follow the evidence, to follow the data, to kind of ignore the political rhetoric, but rather focus on what's actually happening on the ground, there is dissonance right now between the rhetoric and what's actually happening on the ground. And states continue to pass reforms. The problem is that most people are lazy, to be honest, in their analysis. They look at the federal government and they use the federal government as a benchmark to draw these conclusions on whether the movement is alive or dead. And yes, it is true that on the federal level, we are facing real challenges. But it also true that in the states, look, we're also seeing bad bills, and don't get me wrong, we're seeing bad laws passed for sure, but we're also seeing a lot of good laws. And I personally rather elevate that to draw a narrative.
Well, and even at the federal level, I think before this crime bill conversation started, and I think we probably could have seen it coming with the elevation of Stephen Miller as the main domestic policy person for Trump too. But I mean, even if you look at the federal level, the track record from 2018 to 2024 was perfectly solid. I mean, we certainly didn't win every fight, but starting with the First Step Act, there have been other bills that have passed, federal prison oversight, for example, and there's been important ways that the movement came together to defeat bad bills that were advanced by non-reform members of the Republican Party. So before this crime bill, I mean, this is part of why I want to have you on, is that there's such a long track record and body of evidence that criminal justice reform is working as a bipartisan approach. One thing that I always like that you point out is sometimes I think this is true of a lot of movements, but definitely in the criminal justice movement, there can be a bit of wallowing in sort of the distance we have to go, which isn't, in fact, a very far distance. But can you talk about the progress we've made just on the number of people in prison and jail? I think that's something that, from the peak of mass incarceration, I think that's something that people often don't understand when we talk about the progress of criminal justice reform.
Yeah, no, that's such a great point. Thank you for asking that. We were winning. And I argue again that we're still winning, but there's no question we're not winning as much as we were in the 2010s. So mass incarceration hit a peak in about 2009 when the nationwide jail and prison population was about 2.3 million. Then from 2009 to 2010, those rates were about the same. To 2020 or 2021, we saw a more than 30% reduction in incarceration rates across America. More than 30%. You and I, Janos, we were part of the Smart Justice campaign, which had a goal of 50% decarceration. We were more than halfway there. I think it peaked at a 33, maybe 34% nationwide decarceration. Some states, like the state of New Jersey, where I'm sitting right now, saw close to a 60% decarceration. So we were winning.
Crime was going down.
And crime was going down. Thank you for making that point. Then we had the summer of 2020 and lockdowns and COVID and all the shenanigans that went along with that. And crime went up. And in some cities, it went up really, really, really seriously. And also the politics began to change. A backlash formed that seized this moment and exploited this moment where crime generally did go up. But even during these moments, nationwide incarceration rates went up 2% in 2021-22, and then another 2% in 2023. We're still waiting for data, I think, for 2024. Some of my years may be wrong here. But in general, we've seen about a 4% increase in incarceration nationwide since the 30+% decrease in incarceration rates. So overall, we're still at a moment that is a lot better if your measurement of success is volume of incarceration than we were back in the 2000s. On crime, as you know, Janos, we're actually at a really good moment right now where crime is going down dramatically. I think last year is on record to see the largest decrease in murders since homicides were recorded. So we're actually in the right trajectory. Having said all that, and I'm happy to talk about messaging. And I know I learn a lot from you, Janos, about messaging. I think you're one of the more sophisticated messengers on this issue. Right. Well, we should celebrate that crime rates are down. And in fact, in many places are down dramatically. I do not think that should be our top line talking point, because the fact is that crime is still a very serious issue in many parts of America.
Well, it's going to be omnipresent in all of our lives all the time, just with everything from the way news covers it to Ring cameras to, next door groups. I mean, crime will always
No, but it's also genuinely a problem. I mean, even though we have faced a dramatic decrease in violent crime, the United States is still an outlier when it comes to violent crime rates when you compare us to other Western industrialized countries. We are an outlier. So I think the movement does need to take that more seriously. I do think the movement space needs to provide more of a vision for how it will address the fact that crime and violent crime is a problem, is a serious problem. And that's where I think actually the movement space hasn't done as good of a job. It's one of the pleasures that I've been receiving being now in academia. I'm surrounded by scholars like Patrick Sharkey, right, who sits in this building where I am right now, who's done incredible research on how to reduce violent crime rates in a way that is pro-civil rights, pro-human rights. And I think more of his research and similar research needs to blend itself into the advocacy space. Because at least when I was at the I don't think we did a good job talking about this.
And not just the advocacy space, but I mean, with Zohran Mamdani becoming the most high-profile mayor in a long time on the left, it'll be an opportunity to see how some of those lessons can be directly applied into the biggest city in America.
And I know that he has supported, innovations like community violence intervention programs, which I just literally attended a lecture on this about 3 weeks ago, sharing all this data to show how it's been a successful model, which is really unfortunate in the sense of the Trump administration has been trying to defund that movement, even though all indications and all objective data show that it's been a successful effort to reduce, violence. But I'm excited to see what happens in New York City on these issues. But obviously, the politics of New York City are also really complicated.
Absolutely. So there's a couple more things to talk about in the present, but I do want to go back to the past, talk about, campaign for smart justice. That was, you were there for, I think, 7 years, a lot of big moments there. Real quickly, what are some big criminal justice wins that happened in parts of the country that most people wouldn't expect or maybe haven't heard about?
I mean, look, the story that I always like to tell about smart justice is Election Day 2016, when voters went to the ballot box, and they did two things. One, they voted for Donald Trump overwhelmingly. He won by the second largest margin in the nation that year in 2016 Oklahoma. But then they also voted overwhelmingly for two criminal justice reforms that were more progressive than blue states like Rhode Island and Maryland at that time. One, they voted for defelonization of all drug possession, no matter the drug. And second, it was essentially a defund bill. They voted for reinvesting any savings back into communities and community support programs. And that was the day that, for me, it all clicked. That was the day when I realized people who support Donald Trump, people who identify as Republican, even MAGA Republican or conservative Republican, also support criminal justice reform, even in what we would define as progressive criminal justice reform, like defelonization of drug possession. So to me, that is, and that campaign was run by Smart Justice, Allison Holcomb at that time. It was a brilliant campaign. But then the other kind of magical moments that I remember are, look, the DA races. I remember when we worked on the Philly DA race back in 2017, when few people were talking about it other than an amazing coalition on the ground in Philadelphia to support then a politician that almost no one knew, Larry Krasner. And it was incredible to celebrate his third term victory.
Right. He's now probably one of the longest serving big city DAs in the country.
Yeah. And he came from a city that used to have a DA that the New York Times called America's deadliest DA. Because it was a DA in a heavily Democratic city that sought the death penalty more than any other DA. And by the way, the way also that we worked on the DA race in Philadelphia was, and again, this was part of the theory of change that Janos helped us build it, to formally incarcerated people in our advocacy efforts to make sure that they were the ones who were talking about their own personal experiences when making the case for reform. So in that Philly DA race in 2017, our tactic was to hire 51 formerly incarcerated people to knock on the doors of more than 12,000 ACLU members who were also voters in Philadelphia, and to make the case for why, in a nonpartisan manner, they should support a DA who was committed to ending mass incarceration. That was a tactic that we first deployed in Philadelphia, but then it quickly spread across the country. And I think by the time I left, we had engaged in dozens upon dozens of DA races. I also think back to Florida election day in 2018.
Sure.
Being in Miami on the day that voters restored voting rights to more than 1 million people, right? This was a campaign led by Desmond Meade that the ACLU played a heavy role. I think we were the biggest investor in that campaign. And to see the power of the movement coming together to engage in this audacious reform. So there are many. I actually also remember, I don't remember if you were there. I don't think you were. For me, one of my most amazing memories from my Smart Justice days was in the Suffolk County Detention House in Boston, where we held a debate for DA.
It was right before I joined. I remember this. Yes.
Yeah. It was in the Suffolk County jailhouse, and the only people that could ask the DA candidates questions were currently incarcerated people. It was like, I remember sitting in one of the front rows and I almost started crying, because for me, this was like a major shift in power, where DA candidates had to make the case to people why they should support pretrial detention or not, and they had to speak directly to currently incarcerated people. So it's those types of tactics that and victories that I have really fond memories of, and you were a key part of many of them.
Well, thank you. And one thing I want to give you credit for, and you alluded to it in the Philly answer and in talking about the debate, the Smart Justice campaign was very serious about elevating people who are directly impacted by the system, which I think is more commonly understood to be a good idea now by the movement, but certainly was new for an organization like the ACLU, and for, I think most national organizations were not doing that at the time. I think there were something like 35 or 40 full-time staff at the ACLU who were formerly incarcerated, leading campaigns in places like North Carolina and Michigan. And just want to give you credit for doing that. And also, I mean, I think it bore out that it's not only, quote, the right thing to do, but it's just more effective to have people who are deeply immersed in these campaigns and having leadership roles in them who have actually been through the system and understand the consequences of the policies we're fighting for.
Yeah, look, and a lot of it was honestly motivated by your work with the Closed Rikers campaign. But yeah, I'm really proud of that. So thank you. And I got to say, I've now brought it into my teaching at Princeton. So I just came back on a red eye a couple of days ago from Seattle, where I took my students to meet with Chris Blackwell, who's currently incarcerated in the Washington Correction Center, just came out with a book making the case for ending solitary confinement. And I wanted my students to meet with him. Someone who's incarcerated, has a 43-year sentence, and I wanted for them to hear directly his experience so that as they work on a report on solitary confinement practices on death row, they have him in mind, that it's not just about numbers, but it's actually about human beings.
That's great. And we're at dream.org, we're friends with Chris and his partner Chelsea, and I
we
think
saw Chelsea. She's amazing.
I think Chris is doing amazing.
Oh, right, Chelsea used to work for Dream. That's right.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, everybody who works at Dream on justice issues is directly impacted, which is something we're pretty proud of.
I think I've told you this. I will now say it officially on the record. I'm a huge fan of the work that the Dream Justice team does. I really think you guys are doing groundbreaking work.
Thank you. So appreciate that. So moving just into the present, I think what I'm taking away from this conversation, I mean, I thought it beforehand, but really just hearing you name all those wins out loud and hearing about all the progress out loud, I'm really looking at this crime bill fight as what you said earlier, like that it's an outlier, it's a blip. It may be a very messy and large and loud blip, right? But it really does, if you just look at the trajectory of reform in this country, this is not the right answer on a policy level. This is not the right answer on a political level. And this is why I'm so confident that if we organize right on this, we can defeat it. I mean, I can tell from talking to conservative partners, from talking to certain Republican offices, that this is not what people who care about public safety and criminal justice reform would be doing to solve the problem. But we unfortunately have a scenario in which the loudest voice in the room, as always, is Donald Trump. So we can't avoid the conversation. We can't avoid the fact that the crime bill is happening. But what's your thoughts on the best way to respond to a bill that will likely be terrible from a policy perspective and partisan from a political perspective in light of the conversation we've just been having?
Yeah, I think two things. First of all, we need to build the right political coalitions. We need, and by we, I mean now the progressive left, to build coalitions that work closely with conservative Republicans, with MAGA Republicans on making the case for why we're in the smart justice era. And they are there. They really are. Janos, you and I know that. We brought to Princeton, including
talk about Princeton.
Yeah, so last year we brought to campus 14 organizations, 7 on the left and 7 on the right, including Dream, to spend 2 days on campus to try to come up with a common set of principles to guide both the left and right on criminal justice policymaking. And it was kind of like a constitutional convention. And we came out of the 2 days and then weeks of, paper shuffling with 4 principles that both the left and the right could agree on: safety, fairness, dignity, and accountability. And I want to harp for a second on dignity, right? Because dignity, in my view, is the most powerful of those principles. For the left, dignity is the core of everything, right? It's literally the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the first provision. It's the foundation for all human rights law.
We literally ran a Dignity for Incarcerated Women campaign that passed bills in 13 states. Yeah.
Exactly. But for the right, it is also a core value. The dignity comes because we're all created in the image of God, or Tzelet Elohim, as you say in Hebrew from the Bible. So here's like an example of where you have the same value that drives both movements. Yet by naming it, by saying it, it really brings people together. And I'll give it to the conservative space, and you were there, Janos. They're the ones who raised this initially as the principle that guides them. Yep. And I think many on the left almost fell over because immediately that resonated. So I think if we bring together these allies and focus on what we agree on rather than what we disagree on, will be huge. And then the second thing we have to do is we need to elevate what's happening in the states as an example of how the Trump crime bill is an outlier.
Yep.
Make the federalism argument. Make the argument that the states are the incubators of innovation. And right now, the states, 14 states in 2025 alone, since Trump took office for a second time, have passed bipartisan criminal justice reform. They should be the messengers. We should be calling on the federal government to follow the lead of the states, not to try to trample on the states. And I think that message, if we were building a coalition that includes conservative allies, MAGA allies, as well as elevating the experience of the states, I think we can win.
I think that's really well said. Well, it's always so good to hear your thoughts, Udi, and to catch up and to get your perspective. Appreciate all you've done for this movement. So thank you so much for joining us today.
This is way too fast. I really enjoyed it.
Well, we'll have you back again down the road.
Thank you, Janos.
All right.
Thanks for listening. It's Naomi again, and I'm back here with our host, Janos. If you're interested in following today's guest, Udi, on socials, check the links in the description. We are recording this closing on December 4th, 2025, and it's a cold one here in DC. I also can't believe we're already in the last month of the year. It's been an action-packed one, but Janos, I want to give it to you to talk about anything that you've seen in the news lately that's piqued your interest or that you feel like relates to what folks would be interested in who are listening.
Absolutely. Well, there's two things. One is we heard in our conversation with Udi that this Trump so-called crime bill is really an aberration from the bipartisan criminal justice work that's been happening across the country for so long. And just this week, we got another example of that. In the House, they passed the Count the Crimes Act, which is a very bipartisan initiative to literally figure out how many federal crimes there are, which is something that no one knows the answer to. And you got Chip Roy, who's a very right-wing member of the Republican delegation, teaming up with Democratic co-sponsors. And it just goes to show what Udi was saying, that there really is an appetite for bipartisan criminal justice reform, that this bill is really an outlier in contravention to. The other thing that happened this week is just a series of reminders around why this administration probably shouldn't be given more federal power because of the way that it currently treats the rule of law. So just in this past week, you had Donald Trump saying that he would override every Joe Biden signed document, which is not something he can legally do. You saw him saying he would denaturalize U.S. citizens who opposed him, which is also something he can't do. We obviously have the controversy going on with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth killing people without even knowing if they're drug traffickers, whether or not he even could kill them if they were. And then finally, probably most relevant to this conversation, you had an investigation launched into Mark Kelly, who is a decorated war hero, NASA astronaut, now U.S. Senator from Arizona, who obviously has become a critic of the Trump administration policy. And I think it just goes to show that if they can go after Senator Mark Kelly now on the specious grounds that they have, what's to stop them from doing this when they have even more federal power to do so? And this is a strong argument against giving this administration what they want with the crime bill.
Yep, and you mentioned how we talked a lot about bipartisan criminal justice, and I want to add as well that we'll be plugging the article by Udi that y'all referenced during the conversation about how bipartisan criminal justice reform is very much still alive. If y'all want to give that a read, it's a great article. And next week is an exciting one at dream.org. We have a lobby day, maybe our last one of the year. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. We love going to the Hill, even when it's cold. And I know this is Naomi's first winter in D.C., so wish her luck. Yeah, we're going to be on the Hill December 9th talking to a lot of Senate offices about the issues you've been hearing about for the last couple of episodes. So wish us luck, and we hope to be doing plenty more of these in the new year.
Yeah, and that lobby day is just one of a few ways that we're hard at work on the state and federal level working to advance progressive criminal justice reform. But we do need the help of community advocates like you, and there are ways for you to get involved. You can click the link in the description to join our National Crime Bill Response Team. By joining, you'll be a part of a rapid response crew that'll be the first to act when Congress tries to push another harmful crime bill through. And by joining that, you'll get real-time updates, action alerts, and the chance to help mobilize your communities when it counts most.
Even though everybody can make a difference, an extra plug-in for people who are from Nevada, New Hampshire, Maine, Arizona, Michigan, some of the most important states for this upcoming fight. So if you are from there or you know of people who are from those states and want to get involved, then it's extra important to ask them to sign up and join us.
Yep. And that's it for now. We'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks' time. For now, be well and don't quit your daydream.